Hello everybody, my name is Ratnus, and in today's video we are going to give a report card to Dragonflight so far. So I've created some categories here. It's not an exhaustive list, but I've tried my best to include broad topics for all the major things I could think of about the expansion so far. And I figured we'd go through and give some letter grades in both 10.0, 10.1, and any announced future plans on any of these topics as well. And just sort of see how everything is shaping up. So the first category I have is content pacing, which I think is an obvious, sort of softball to start things off here, because I feel like the content pacing, it's pretty hard to argue. Oh, my stupid dragon. I keep being mounted on my dragon for these videos, and it just starts just roaring in the background as soon as I hit start recording. The content pacing seems like an obvious softball, right? Like, it's hard to find somebody who's... It was easy to find the rushed expansion narrative leading up to the expansion coming out. But it's been pretty hard to find people that have been negative about content pacing really since the expansion has come out. It's been pretty universally well received, and I'm one of the people who's been receiving it well. It's been nice that there's just always kind of been stuff going on, been stuff to do. The next content is always... You're always excited about, and it's coming soon, right? Now we've got 10.1.5 coming soon, and presumably by the time that comes out, and by the time we've started engaging with that, we'll know stuff about 10.2, and by the time that comes out, we'll know stuff about 10.2.5, and then 10.3 and 11.0, and so as of right now, it's hard to give this anything other than just an A. Okay, my A, we might have to revert to just the text tool instead of the drawing tool. A. And then another A. Let's see if I can do it again here. Looks like I can. And again, we'll just give it an A across the board on content pacing. This has been great. It's been surprisingly fast. 10.0 was surprisingly fast. 10.1 was surprisingly fast, beating Diablo instead of coming out, after Diablo, which is kind of when I was more expecting it maybe. The talent system, I think, as well. This one is a little bit more of a mixed bag, but I think has been generally very good. I've played a few different specs reasonably deeply so far this expansion, and I've played a lot of specs at a more shallow level. And of the specs that I've played with reasonable depth, there's actually been quite a lot of talent thinking to be done in like pushing Mythic Plus title and in Mythic progression rating. There's been a lot of different stuff there. There are still a lot of talents that aren't especially compelling. There's a lot of talent trees with kind of dead-end branches or paths that are traps to take, those sorts of things. So I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's been nice to see them iterating on this as rapidly as they have been as well. I was kind of expecting this to be a system that came out and then got left behind until 11.0, right? And was kind of just, these are the talents for this expansion, we'll make whatever changes we need to next expansion. But they've actually... now most classes, I think, have had medium-sized changes to various either spec or class trees at this point. Of course, there are a few outliers that still need some adjustment, and many talent trees still have a long way to go before I would say they're, like, perfect. But most forms of content, I think there is skill and fun to be had looking at your talent tree for most specs, which... I think is pretty sweet and has added a lot of excitement to me for the game. So I'm going to tentatively give this an A-. Again, I think there's room for improvement here. And I think that on the future plan things, the trajectory has just been upwards. It's been upwards here. So if anything, maybe this is like B+, A- here. In the future plans, I guess we know a little bit about the mage rework, the paladin stuff that's coming. Those also seem good. I don't know. I'm just going to give this A for the future plans because, again, it seems like the trajectory is upward here, and it seems like they're doing a good job of changing bad talent trees into good ones and not, like, messing with good ones too much as well, which is another good thing. Of course, it's going to be hard to keep that trend up forever because invariably the good specs are also going to need to get changed at some point in, like, 11.1 to keep things fresh. Or 11.0. Raids. So this is actually, I think, the area where I think the game has done the least well compared to Shadowlands. This might be a bit of a divisive take, but this expansion has featured some encounters that I think were really quite bad. Dathia, Razageth Mythic. Razageth Heroic was one of the best heroic fights I think I've ever done, but Razageth Mythic, I think was really really a letdown. Just a 20-year-long encounter with 5 phases, of which like 3 of them didn't need to exist. And then this tier, I don't actually think has been much better either. I mean, you've got Zaskarn just sitting there, being horrifically broken, needing a fix, and still not really being all that rewarding of an encounter post-fix. You've got Magmarax, just a big question mark in terms of, what is this classic boss doing in my retail World of Warcraft? You've got Echo of Neltharion with its Volcanic Heart mechanic, that an otherwise good fight, marred by an attempt to make a mechanic that just does not accomplish what it's trying to do there. You've got Scale Commander Sarkareth this patch, which I do think is a pretty good fight. I think that fight is solid, upper middle tier or lower top tier for end boss fights. But still, overall, there's been a lot of weak fights this expansion, in my opinion. So I'm going to go with a C in 10.0. I think Vault of the Incarnates was a pretty forgettable raid. And I'm going to go with a C plus for 10.1 for raid design. I think that's Zaskarn, Magmarax. The Zaskarn and Magmarax, Echo of Neltharion are all either hugely or moderately flawed things, and that's 3 of the 4 last fights in the tier. That's a lot. That's a lot of damage. That being said, I think that I don't think there's like structural problems with the design here. It's not like we're seeing a huge shift towards like a consistent new bad philosophy with raid fights. If anything, the Sarkareth design I think is a really good one for an end boss fight. It's got a nice short length. It's got you're not holding damage to push at certain percents, which has always been a complaint of mine about a lot of end boss fights. But like the Jailer before it, Sarkareth doesn't have that problem, which is that makes that fight a lot more fun to just have damage be relevant the whole way through and not be sitting there being like, okay, stop damage. We have to push at 257 exactly, or else, our cooldowns are bad. So I'm optimistic for the future. So even though we don't know anything about the future plans for Raid, I'm going to assume that they are going to get better than they were in 10.0 and 10.1. So I'm going to go with a B for that, because I'm generally optimistic based on a general vibe of optimism I've been getting about the expansion so far. All right, now Mythic Plus. Season 1 Mythic Plus was obviously marred by the Thundering Affix, an affix that is kind of an unforced error on an otherwise pretty good set of dungeons. It was also marred by Temple of the Jade Serpent, which was a dungeon that I think didn't really belong there, and it didn't belong in an unnerfed state for so long. For the entirety of that season, that dungeon had some stuff in it that I don't think should have been allowed to exist like that the whole way through. It was also marred by Shadow Moon Burial Grounds and Court of Stars. Those dungeons did a lot of damage to the high-end scene. Pushing title in Season 1 was an experience of do a key, hope it turns into Shadow Moon or Court of Stars, do the Shadow Moon or Court of Stars, reroll all your other keys. You'd be like trying to get a 25 Algathar or something, and you would just have this key inventory of like, okay, we've got 1 Court of Stars. All right, let's do it. Okay, we did it. Right? Okay, no, we missed it. Okay, let's try and do this 24. Oh my god, it's 25 Court of Stars. All right. Let's see what 26 we get. Okay, we re-rolled all our other keys. We didn't get the 25 Algathar, but we got another Court of Stars. Let's go run that. Okay, we did that. Finally, we have this one attempt at the Algathar or whatever. And that was pretty bad. I worry a little bit that Underrot is going to do a similar thing in 10.1 for the title pushing scene. And you can also already see it being done in just the casual side of keying. You can just look at, well, I guess if Radar is up, okay, you can see, the top of the IO boards is already just a underwrought fiesta. But even if we go to page 1,000 of the Radar IO leaderboards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 of the top 12 of the runs between 20,000 and 20,020 are underwroughts, and there are 8 different dungeons. Now, to be fair, I've randomed into a 2 chests part of this. So if we go to 1,000 to 100, now we're in 1 chest territory, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 7 of 20 here are underrots. So underrot is a similar problem in 10.1. Having one really hard dungeon sucks, but having one really easy dungeon also does bad things to the enjoyment of an M+ season for me. So for Season 1, I'm going to deduct a letter grade for Thundering, and I'm going to deduct a letter grade for Temple and Court and Shadow and Burial Grounds. So I'm going to put this down to a C. I do think what they did with Ruby Life Pools, Azure Vault, Knocket Offensive even, these were dungeons where they did a really good job of coming in, taking some dungeons that launched a little bit shaky, and then quickly shaping them up and making them really good. And those dungeons ended up being a lot of fun. So I think that was really good, but I gotta deduct points for all those things I mentioned. 10.1, I'm a bit more confident. I'm going to give that a B-. I'm deducting points for Underrot, and I think that some of the other dungeons as well are still pretty rough around the edges. I'm a little concerned about the pace of hotfixing as well. At the start of the season, we saw a lot of dungeon hotfixing coming in for 10.1 dungeons, but there hasn't been any news on that front for a few weeks, and there are still some mobs that are just grossly differently tuned than others. You've got mobs like the ones at the end of Halls of Infusion. You've got like that pack upstairs in Neltheris going right. There's just a bunch of mobs that don't feel like the other mobs in these dungeons. You've got like the entirety of Vortex Pinnacle. So hopefully those are changing soon. The removal of the seasonal affix is something that I think dramatically raises the floor for how fun a season can be, but it does also lower the ceiling as well. So I do hope at some point in the future they consider bringing back the seasonal, even if it's just in the form of like, hey, let's bring back a good old seasonal that people liked. Let's bring back Awakened this season. I think that could be a good thing to do for, say, Dragonflight Season 4, maybe reprising a bunch of dungeons from earlier in Dragonflight, but throwing in Awakened to completely shake them up. Could be a really good way to do that. So that's something I hope they do. One thing we know they're going to do is bring in Dawn of the Infinite in Season 3, the new Mega Dungeon. So I'm pretty excited about that. I've liked... Of the 6 Mega Dungeon M+, Mechagon had some problems with like Junkyard being too easy, but they all have been fun dungeons to do, in my opinion. Those bosses are usually pretty fun. So again, I'm going to give a grade here that's higher than the 10.0 or 10.1 grades for the future plans so far. I think that the dungeon side of things, I'm still optimistic, although the more weeks we go without 10.1 dungeon hotfixes coming in, the more I'm inclined to downgrade both the 10.1 and the kind of future plans and expectations grade for this. All right, Dragon Riding, here's another softball. This one is an easy, at least for me, it's an easy A for 10.0. 10.1, they didn't really iterate too much on this, although they added in ground skimming, but ground skimming is kind of whatever. They added in aerial stop, I guess, in 10.0.5 as well. But in future plans, this is, it's an A+. They're planning to make Dragon Riding go more than just in the Dragon Isles. They're talking about keeping it for the future, and they're looking at rigging a bunch of old mounts to be Dragon Riding as well, which fixes one of the problems of Dragon Riding, which is that everybody's on the same, 5 mounts as each other, and you'd have all these old mounts in your stable that you can't use. All right, itemization. So itemization has been an interesting one. There's been a lot of great items created in Dragonflight. Manic Grief Torch, that's a sweet item. Galecaller's Boon, that's a sweet item. There's been a lot of cool stuff they've tried. The class-themed trinkets out of Echo of Neltharion, which I guess we'll talk about in the 10.1 stuff. But on the 10.0 side of things, we had the very rare items coming in a very annoying way, especially combined with the Great Vault, that I think was a pretty big problem for that season. And the fact that my main character never got a Mythic Aranog ring ended up being something that meant I was behind for all of Season 2 progression as well, which is not a good feeling. So for 10.0, I think I have to deduct moderate points for how the very rare items worked that season. I think that the fact that you can't deterministically acquire these items, and you can't even necessarily have them going into the next raid if they're BIS, for the whole next raid is a problem, especially if they're not willing to make sure that they're not BIS for the whole next raid. Aranog Mythic Ring, BIS for all of Aberrus. If you can't, but it's very rare out of Vault of the Incarnates. That, to me, is I think you should always be able to have your character have BIS gear if you play the whole season before on Mythic difficulty. I don't think that's an unreasonable ask, and I think that's something that was really disappointing about 10.0, especially because it was an issue that was flagged early on in that season, and there was just radio silence the whole time. There was a whole lot of like, yeah, we're aware that people feel bad, but basically it felt like that was a lower priority than their other priorities, which is fine. But as a player, that's one of my highest priorities. I have to deduct a lot of points for that, because that ruined a lot of my enjoyment of the gearing. The very rare items in general, I think, took a pretty good step upward, so I'm going to give this itemization a C. Despite there being a lot of good items, the way that very rares worked out in 10.0, I think there was a degree of stubbornness to it that was really unfortunate and bad. The Aeronog Ring came out in 10.0, or sorry, not the Aeronog Ring, the Onyx Amulet came out in 10.0.5. That also deserves a lot of criticism, in my opinion. The Onyx Amulet came out. On PTR, everybody was talking for ages about like, oh, this ring is not very good. And then it came out and they buffed a bunch of stones by like 80%. And then it was like, okay, this ring is now BIS forever for these specs. And it is still not very good for these specs. And they had said, we don't want it to be better than a Mythic Aberrus ring. And then Aberrus the Shadowed Crucible came out. And for 19 of the 38 specs or something, it was BIS for all of progression. And they were like, yep, oopsie, but we're not going to nerf it until 10.1.5 because we don't want people who farmed it to have lost out and to have had that farming, be a mistake or whatever. So yeah, that was another really unfortunate, unforced error. The Onyx Amulet, to me, the problem with it as well is that it is bad for like high-end players to have an item doing that. I mean, it's not even that bad for us. It's just like, it's annoying. But I don't think I think it's worth it to have things be annoying for high-end players if they are fun and cool for casual players, which Onyx Amulet was sort of positioned to be that item in the sense of like, oh yeah, you acquire it through the Zaralek or the Zeskara Vaults, which by the way, Zeskara Vaults, not something that's on this list, but that was a great little minigame system. If anything, it's a shame it was only for a sub patch, because Zeskara Vaults actually was really cool. That was a really, really well-designed little area. But the Onyx Amulet's effect itself were just like a bunch of boring procs. Like there were a bunch of like Shard of Domination level boring procs that you only notice if you have details installed and you open details, which if you're going to make an item that is annoying for the details installed community, it should at least be fun for the non-details installed community and do something cool for them, but it doesn't do anything at all for that player base. So I don't know. It seems to me like there's just no upside and a lot of downsides to the way that the Onyx Amulet was created and implemented. The only upside to it was like, hey, a free ring slot for my new character, a free BIS ring slot for a newly created character that you don't have to go into the raid for. That, I guess, is some nice alt catch-up and some nice late in the patch gearing improvement, which is a fine part of it. But again, the Onyx Amulet ring, I'm going to give that a D here. That's a D for the Amulet here between 10.0 and 10.1, and that was really bad. 10.1 gearing has had some interesting changes. So 10.1, we saw very rare items taking a substantial power level nerf compared to 10.0, and I think that's the right move, especially if they don't want to give us a deterministic way of acquiring those items over time. I think the best answer would be to have exciting, very rare items that we could just guaranteed get if we did the raid for 2 months or 4 months or whatever. Some sort of system where, if you kill Mythic Echo of Neltharion 5 times, you get a guaranteed class trinket. And obviously, like, it can still drop before then and be an exciting drop. But if they're not willing to do that, making it so that the class trinket is only good for a few specs, that's probably the next best way to handle this, because unlike the Aeronog ring, we don't all want it, and so it's not as high of a demand item. So that's good. I do think the way the class trinkets were tuned is a little bit whack, because it does feel like they're probably a little bit too weak for most specs, especially given that they come with a downside. Like, even if you're simming them, not even factoring in the downside, they're just not even good for a lot of specs, which is maybe a little weird. The cloak from Sarkareth, I think, is great. I think that's a really cool design for an item. It's got your no stamina, right? But a lot of power behind it, extra damage. It steals some stats from allies, but it steals their lowest stats. So that cost is not very high. The main cost is you're equipping a cloak without stamina, and you can't equip an undulating spore cloak as well. That item's broken. Everybody should craft one of those. But that item's cool. The Screaming Black Dragon Scale is great. I think that's a really good first boss, very rare item. It's just like a generic, not overpowered stat stick or stat proc item off of the first boss. The way that the Black Dragon Scale works is that for like most specs, it's like your third or fourth best trinket, which is great, right? Like, oh, if you get one of those, neat, right? Nice. Especially you maybe don't have the other good trinkets, or maybe you're playing one of the specs where it's actually your second best trinket. But it's not like the Whispering Incarnate icon, where for almost all specs, that's your BIS item. And for the ones where it's not your BIS item, you need to wear it because it's buffing the rest of your raid or whatever. So I think that was really smart. I think that was good. I think the Rashok polearm is sick. I think making some very rare weapons like that is also always cool. So yeah, I'm a fan of the trajectory of the very rare items. I think 10.1 itemization. Also, we've got to talk about the upgrade system. The upgrade system alone, I think, adds a lot to 10.1. The upgrade system is really powerful, has a lot of longevity to it, and is massively improving the alt experience of the game as well. I think that the upgrade system probably will and should take some nerfs in future patches. Not too much, but I think there is room for us to power up a little bit more slowly in the first few weeks of the patch. When I say this, I've already got some people in the comments very angrily being like, well, you play the game for 27 hours a day, so you get all the power out of this. But I'm thinking about nerfs that would disproportionately affect the people who play the game 27 hours a day and not the people who don't. So something like the Crest weekly limit is something that I think could be a good target, because players like me are hitting the Worms and Aspect Crest limit on the first few weeks, but players who don't play as much aren't doing that and are a little further behind. So I think that could be something that you could nerf from like 10 crests per week to 5 or something, and it could be fine. I mean, again, at this point in the patch, it wouldn't matter. By a couple weeks ago in the patch, it wouldn't have mattered for almost anybody what the weekly cap limit would have been. But for those first few weeks, it did feel a little bit weird that like on the 8th day of the patch, someone was like, hey, you want to do some Mythic Plus? And I was like, yeah, but my main doesn't need anything. I guess I'll go on my alt, which is not... That's a weird feeling. It's not bad that you can get all the stuff you really need early in the patch, but I think that the fact that there wasn't reward at all out of that content in the later weeks or in weeks past the first was a weird thing. And again, that it's not like that was even that rare of a phenomenon, right? Like you didn't have to be doing splits and all that kind of stuff for that to be true for your character. But the way that they made a lot of this stuff, a lot of it's really good. So I'm going to give 10.1 itemization an A. I think that in practice, 10.1's item experience was hurt by the sins of 10.0, the Onyx Amulet, the very rare items. And so I had less fun than an A off of this, but I want to rate that separately. I've already penalized 10.0 for that. I'm not going to penalize 10.1. And the future plans, we don't know much. We don't know much about the itemization for future seasons, except that they're probably keeping the upgrade system. They're making some tweaks to it potentially. We don't know what. I assume nerfs, but we don't know what. And yeah, we know some of the trinkets that are coming that look cool, but that doesn't make an itemization system. So again, I'm gonna put an A here. I think it's just fair, knowing that the upgrade system is likely to survive and be iterated on. Seems really good. Set bonuses. So tier sets have returned. They were there in Sepulcher, but they're now here kind of as a permanent thing once again. And I think that the way that tier sets have returned has been broadly good. I think in 10.0, they intentionally, and they said this, they intentionally made them pretty simple because we were all learning these new talent systems. And so most set bonuses were like, you do 5% increased damage with this button. This button has 5% increased critical strike chance or whatever. There was all kind of, just whatever bonuses. There were a few that were interesting and fun to play with, like getting a free whatever it is, cast of the thingy on Moonkins, those sorts of effects. But for the most part, these set bonuses were forgettable in the sense that you could literally forget you had them and keep playing your spec equally well. And that to me is pretty boring. I understand why they wanted to do that in 10.0 with the new talent system, but I still can't give that an A because, you know, they weren't doing anything good. Maybe they didn't do anything bad, but they also, the set bonuses in this tier didn't really do anything good. I'm not sure it was better than just not having set bonuses for Vault of the Incarnates, because that then created a problem where they had to nerf some of them to make sure that the 10.1 ones were worth upgrading into, and that maybe also means that the slope of the tier sets this expansion is going to end up being a little bit too high. So maybe it would have been best to just be like, yeah, they're coming in Aberrus, but I guess maybe just having something is better than having nothing. I don't know. In Aberrus, the set bonuses, so not only were the bonuses themselves a lot better, a lot more interesting, most of them were pretty good. There were a few sinkers. A few classes got some pretty bad ones, but most classes got some pretty good ones. Most classes that had bad ones spoiled on PTR got updated to have good ones over the course of the PTR cycle as well. And the acquisition for tier got a lot better as well, which I'm going to factor into this one rather than itemization because I can do what I want. It's my report card. And so I'm going to give this one an A for 10.1 as well. I think that the set bonuses were better, and the way that you can acquire tier sets is better. I will say, I think the Catalyst needs to be rethought because I actually was a defender of the slow Catalyst in 10.0 and in 9.2. In those patches, I thought, all right, look, we have tier that you can acquire from Raid, but acquiring it from Raid is a bit of a pain. All right, like there's some friction associated with acquiring it from Raid. So we want the Catalyst to be far enough in the future that it is worth going into Raid and not just being like, I'll get it next week. Who cares? I won't bother raiding, right? You want raids to be a draw for the set bonuses. But what they did in 10.1 was they removed all the friction from getting tier from raid. Now, if you walk into Heroic Aberrus and you kill a couple of bosses, Rathian will show up at your front door with a little box, and inside of it is going to be 4 tier pieces, and you get your 4 set just automatically out of doing. It's not that easy, but it relative to 10.0 and relative to 9.2, the ease of getting 2-piece and especially 4-piece has gone up by a huge amount. The amount of raids that you expect to need to do to get 4-piece has been cut by more than half, I'm almost certain, especially if you're doing Heroic and you get that AOTC token. But even if you're not doing Heroic, even if you get that AOTC token from M+, right, you're getting so much tier compared to previous patches, which means that I think they should look at also reducing the pain for waiting for the Catalyst now, because even though the Catalyst in absolute terms is closer to patch release than it ever has been in the past, in relative terms, it's more of a pain relative to Raid than it used to be, and I think they should reduce that. So my suggestion is to have the Catalyst be out early, but have it only start accumulating free charges around now, around when it actually came out in this patch. And then I saw this on Twitter. I don't actually have the Twitter to pull up. Somebody tweeted this idea, but having you be able to charge the Catalyst with your Worm's Crest or with your Aspect Crest, something like that, be able to get some Catalyst charges out of that. I think that would be a good middle ground to make it so that acquiring tier early on isn't... If it's this easy from Raid, it should be a little bit easier for non-Raid players, I think, as well. And Raid will still be appealing, right? I think what they want is they want Raid to be appealing, and it is. And they made Raid really appealing, Heroic and Normal this time. There is room to make M+ less painful and still have Raid be appealing. I'm somebody who believes Raid should be appealing, but I don't think M+ tier set bonus should be this painful. So future plans here, we'll give it an A- on the set bonuses. We don't know enough about what they're planning to do here. The changes made in 10.1 were good, but I'm curious to see what they're going to say in future. This minus represents the stubbornness for the Catalyst that's existed so far, and the chances that they're going to continue having that be a flaw in the system. Class balance. Class balance is up next, and this is a hot topic on all of my class balance videos. There are a lot of people that are mad at Blizzard for not balancing their spec. There's a lot of people mad at me for talking about class balance at all, instead of just enjoying the game. And there are just a lot of people mad. Class balance, it brings out this rage in us. I think that in relative terms and in absolute terms, class balance has been good. It's been a good expansion for class balance, and that's largely been due to the fact that Blizzard has been willing to do small to medium-sized adjustments to specs multiple times in the first months of the patch. If you look at 10.0, we saw class balance changes every Tuesday like clockwork for the first like 4 weeks of that patch. And that went a really long way towards making specs that were bad less bad, making specs that were good a little bit less good. And it didn't destroy any specs either, which is always the fear, right? People have this reaction to, especially to nerfs, where it's like, oh no, they're going to kill my spec. But I think Blizzard did a really good job of nerfing Prot Warrior in 10.0 without gutting it, right, over the course of that cycle. And, you know, eventually Prot Warrior wasn't the best tank in Season 1, but it was never a bad tank. It was never a tank where you were like, I can't play the game on this. They've destroyed me, right? So I think that this... I actually think this is just an A, the way they've been handling class balance. You can point to some outliers. I think Preservation Evoker in Season 1, Protection Paladin late Season 1, probably pretty egregious examples of, like, things where they needed to take more action. There are some outliers on the low end as well. Certainly there's Windwalker in 10.1. There are some specs that need some more love, but for most combinations of, like, DPS tank or healer and either raid or M+, the answer is it's good right now. It is good. You know, 80-90% of specs are seeing play among high-end players. It's a good time to be, you know, not a FOTM reroller. And I say this as a FOTM reroller. I've played 6 different tanks in the 6 different raids, in the 6 most recent raids, whatever. And I love playing new stuff, playing different classes every patch. I have a lot of fun doing that, but I don't think that playstyle should be as vital for high-end play as it was for a lot of the previous expansions. And I think this expansion, they're doing a good job of that. Again, it's not perfect, but I want to give this an A because I don't think it's reasonable to expect better than what they've been doing here. And you know, if they improve further off this, there's an A+, I guess, available in future patches. But yeah, that seems like how we're looking here. All right, professions and sparks. So they did a big overhaul to professions in 10.0 that massively affected how they interacted with high-end play. Now, instead of just buying your Shadowlands Legendary base for 100k off the auction house, you actually had to engage somewhat with the profession process. You had to find a crafter in trade chat if you cared about actually getting your thing rank 5'd, and that was good. They leaned a lot on this inspiration model of crafting, where a lot of stuff can only be 5-starred either with an insight, or in some cases, even with an insight, you can't guarantee it, and you're just relying on inspiration procs. And that has created this strange problem as well, where it's a little bit confusing. People will set a requirement of 5-star on an order, and then the crafter will be like, oh, I can 5-star this for you, but you can't give me a 5-star requirement because I'm relying on an inspiration proc and recrafts or whatever. So that part has been weird. I think the UI could do a better job of explaining how that works. And if they were dead set on it working this way, if they were dead set on you not being able to take an order, if it was a 5-star craft, even if you could only inspire it, right? And if they were dead set on that, I think they could have made some different choices with how they set up the professions. So that side of things, I'm not sure I like. The profession talent trees have been good. The knowledge point system has been good. There was a lot of complaining early on about the knowledge points not being refundable, but the fact that you can infinitely farm them, to me, I think that's reasonable and fair. And the way the profession knowledge and stuff has worked has been good. I think the solutions that a lot of players proposed about, like, respecking your profession points would have been really bad. If you imagine a world where we could have respected talent points early on, then, you know, I would have been respecking between being a breastplate crafter and being a greaves crafter and being a swords crafter or whatever, depending on which order I was trying to craft, and it would have been really obnoxious. So I think they made a good choice there. Season 1 had your sparks were pretty rigid. There were a few crafts, right? Like if you looked at anybody wearing plate armor, they were wearing Elemental Lariat and Unstable Frostfire Belt, right? If you looked at like leather melee DPS, they were wearing Elemental Lariat and usually like a flaring cowl or something, right? So there were some embellishments. Elemental Lariat is the biggest offender here that were just miles ahead of the other options in Season 1. So that, you know, maybe we can deduct half a letter grade or something like that. But overall, I think it was a well-offered new system. I'm gonna give this a B plus for how Professions and Sparks interacted with high-end content. There's still a lot of friction, a lot of gold involved in this process. The whole dichotomy of like, I'm charging 10K for this, you're just clicking a button. Yeah, but I had to learn all this and get all this recipe, right? Like it's this eternal, conflict that people are having. I land mostly on the side of, the prices, a reasonably high price is sometimes fair for these sorts of things because you've got a recipe that cost you $1 or whatever to get. You're clicking a button on it, but you need to recoup that cost, right? And the recipe is scarce, right? It's expensive. So I think Professions and Sparks worked reasonably well. I wish that the impact on gold was a little bit lower. I wish people could engage with it a little bit more cheaply. Maybe, yeah. I think 10.0 also, the souls, the Zap Throttle Soul Inhaler was pretty annoying in this patch. I think 10.1 deserves a lot of credit, though. It fixed not only the Elemental Lariat, it also has a much better Spark acquisition model. Remember Sparks in Season 1 where you got 5 Sparks from doing story quests. A nice thing about Season 1 was that your alts got 5 Sparks for freezies when you leveled them up after the, first 8 weeks or whatever of the patch. But Season 2, the way that Sparks are dropping like candy if you're behind, and then you can always earn up to the existing cap without too much effort at all, really, really nice. Sparks of Shadowflame are such a good way of setting this up. So that to me is that's an A. And the rework of Lariat, nerfing Lariat, now if we look at embellishments, Undulating Spore Cloak, there's like toxic mail items that are good, there's adaptive mail items that are good, there's Toxic Thorn boots, there's Slimy Expulsion boots, there's the Toxified patch, there's the Shadowflame patch, there's still the Unstable Crossfire belt, right? There's a bunch of other weird embellishments that are situationally good or useful. There's still Lariat long-term potentially being good at full gear levels. There's a lot of good ways to spend your Sparks. And a lot of interesting stuff there. Spore Cloak is a great example as well of a trade-off between DPS and survivability in the embellishment slot that I think is really sweet, and they should explore further and give more good competitive defensive and utility embellishments. I think that would be really sweet as well. Because one of the things about, like, when you're playing a tank looking at your embellishments, besides Spore Cloak, there's not really good defensive ones, which does feel a little bit against the fantasy of being a tank. Like, you should be able to choose damage, but you should also be able to choose defenses, and outside of Spore Cloak, you can't really with embellishments. So that's something that I think they could improve. But overall, I'm actually going to give it an A+ here. It's just hard to look at what they did with Professions and Sparks from 10.0 to 10.1 and not see just huge good improvement. And again, we'll just give this an A here. This is not something where we know too much about future plans, so I'm going to assume kind of a reversion to my general optimistic A baseline. And then finally, we have Evoker. This is the new class. It came out in 10.0. Preservation was broken beyond belief and healed for infinity healing while also having a bunch of great utility later in the raid against fights like Razageth, particularly, but also, Dathia. There was value to be found from an Evoker too, but it was mostly Razageth. Razageth Evoker value was off the charts. That spec was really good. Devastation was a little bit... I think Devastation launched with a little bit less fanfare than they probably would have liked. It was a little bit maybe underpowered, and it ended up taking some sizable buffs in like 2 of the first 5 weeks. Disintegrate damage buff, that kind of stuff that made the spec a little bit more appealing. So that being said, I think Devastation was pretty fun from the start. It had some weirdness to it. So you had this weird stuff where you're like clipping your disintegrates early on in the cast so that you could get more Dragon Rage extension, which that was a interesting playstyle in the sense that, like, if you were min-maxing it, it was fun. But it was counterintuitive in the sense that if you were just like reading your abilities and trying to play based on the kind of synergies they suggested to you, you weren't doing that spec right, which I think is usually a design flaw. So I'm going to give Evoker an A- for how it launched. It was a fun spec at launch, or it was a fun class at launch. It had a really, honestly, like, Preservation being as good as it was, that was a downside. That spec shouldn't have been that good. Devastation being where it was, like low middle of the pack at the start, Blizzard would have preferred it being higher, but I think that was actually fine. I think it was already pretty. It was already good in good hands in that patch, but they probably would have wanted it to made more of a splash and be more good, especially because we didn't know how to use it yet, which made it look worse than it was. In 10.1, Evoker, now Devastation is great. Preservation is, I would say, middle of the pack of healers. It's not a Holy Priest, but it's not bad either. It's fallen a little bit out of favor, but it's doing good. I think they've made some good changes to it. I think crucially with Evoker, they have made good changes to Devastation, despite announcing for the 10.1, or maybe it was 10.1.5 PTR, some very bad changes for Devastation that would have made like haste scale your damage negatively in some cases. But they fixed those. They've been doing good stuff with the talent tree for it as well. And the future plans here for augmentation. That to me is a huge question mark. Augmentation, I have found to be so cool from reading through the abilities. It seems like such a cool spec. But I am really curious how on earth they can make it do good damage in like an average case in a group that is reasonably optimized around it with a player of reasonable skill that is piloting it, and not just do out of this world insane damage in the hyper min-maxed case. So that's going to be something that is still a question mark for me. That being said, I am generally optimistic. I think the spec is cool. So this is a big question mark, but I'm going to put an A here as well. It's tentative, but they've earned a lot of goodwill with a lot of what they've done so far. The interviews about augmentation have been pretty compelling, pretty comforting, I think, as well. We'll have to see how it develops over the PTR cycle. I'm a little bit worried. I can't shake the worry about the spec, but for now, I'm cautiously optimistic. So far, our report card, this future plans category is kind of a little. There's a lot of this stuff we don't actually know all that much about, so I realized as I was putting these letters in here, a lot of them kind of didn't make too much sense. But we can mostly look at these two columns, and the trend has been good. There were a few C's that I gave to stuff in 10.0, only one for 10.1, which is due to some of the glaring problems of Aberrus the Shattered Crucible. But direction has been good, right? Everything is moving in a good direction in 10.1. Future seems bright. It seems like it's going to be a good expansion. If I did this video back in Shadowlands, which I did some videos sort of like it, but I didn't do ones with this format, you would have seen a lot of red and a lot of orange. You would have seen some, I don't know what color F would have been, but it would have been bad for stuff like Conduit Energy, Covenant Lock, Shards of Domination, Korthia Farm, right? Like these Torghast requirements, those would have gone on a progression from like F to maybe D or C in the later parts of the expansion. A few things got fixed at the end of that expansion, but like Dragonflight has launched Dragonflight has launched strong, has spawned strong, has launched strong. It's been good. It's been a good expansion so far. I'm excited for it going forward. I really hope that they can sort out some of these kind of last problems that are in the raid and dungeon philosophy. Even that, it's not been that bad. Just hotfix some of the problems in some of the dungeons that we have right now. Hotfix some of the stuff in Neltheris and Halls of Infusion and Nelth's Lair, right? These dungeons. Stop making Underrots. Stop making Shadowing Burial Grounds and Court of Stars that are way easier than the other dungeons in their field. Next time we're bringing back a super old dungeon. Maybe Vortex Pinnacle type dungeons that are just a straight line aren't the right ones to look at, even if we can maybe balance their mechanics, which is still a process that also should happen more. But that's maybe not the best place to go. I don't know. There's some changes there with the raid fights. Some of it is kind of unavoidable. Sometimes, Zaskarns happen, but hopefully in future tiers they won't, and we can get this into the B and A range. Anyways, that's my report card for Dragonflight so far. Let me know in the comments what a shill I am. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Oh, by the way, if you see in the comments, if anything is replying about like messaging me on Telegram for a prize or something, that's a scam. Do not click that. I've been trying to ban that from my channel, but it's impossible. They just keep making new accounts. It's a bot of some kind. I don't know how it works, but that's a scam. Do not click on that link. Do not message anything that is me or claiming to be me on Telegram. That is a scam. Anyways, thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.